Hello and welcome to Historia Scientia's commentary track for the 2000 film Gladiator starring Russell Crowe. My name is Jason Mount.
Hi, I'm Anthony Stauder.
Today we'll be watching Gladiator and providing some historical background for the people and events depicted therein. We'll be pointing out when the film gets things right, when the film gets things wrong, and providing greater detail regarding some of the history that's there up on the screen. To utilize this commentary track, you're going to need your own copy of the movie. For this commentary, we'll be watching the theatrical version of the film, so that's the version you're going to need as well. What you're going to want to do is you're going to want to pause this commentary track and then cue up the film. When you get to the DreamWorks logo, you'll want to pause the film there and then resume playing this commentary track. With this commentary track playing, you'll then wait for us to give you the signal before you begin and press play on the film. When the signal is given, you'll press play and then resume watching the movie as the commentary track plays as well. In this manner, they'll be synced. So, cue up your film, and if everything's ready to go, press play now. You should be seeing the DreamWorks logo. If you're not, start over. Hans Zimmer's score in this movie is really good. I was fortunate enough to see this in the theater.
I think I first saw it on VHS. So.
Yeah, you and I watched it on VHS. I introduced you to it.
Yeah.
That would have been, 2002?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, I went to see it in the theater on opening night. And then I got back that weekend. And when I got back that weekend for school, my professor had also seen it. He hated it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think it's kind of one of those things where yeah, if a film or something is in your preferred is in an area is touching on an area of your expertise, you're probably going to have some shade of disappointment, and this is definitely a bigger disappointment for historical accuracy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we saw it, right from the opening. Here we've already got inaccuracies. There's not just one final German stronghold and standing in the way of peace. That just didn't happen. This wasn't like, hey, we've conquered the world at this point. That's not what happened. Right. Marcus Aurelius was in fact up at Vindolanda in 180. Of course, here we have the character of Maximus, great Oscar-winning performance by Russell Crowe. But there's no such person as Maximus. He's actually a combination of numerous characters. And we'll touch on some of those characters later. Or, I'm sorry, not characters, but figures, historical figures. But there is no actual Maximus. So right away, we've already got something which is not true. It's fiction. But of course, this is a movie and not a historical documentary.
Right.
Now, this movie used a lot of historical reenactors, and so it saved them on a lot of costuming, from what I understand. And while it's not completely accurate to history, I have to say that as someone who studied Roman history for many, many decades, I just enjoyed seeing a sword and sandal film on the big screen again, because it had been a long time since we'd seen something like this. I'm not sure what it is, because they're very practical pieces of armor, and yet there's something about Roman armor that I just love the look of it. I mean, it's very useful. It's very practical for the type of combat they were using. Here's a character of Quintus, also fictional. Although, as I'll get to later, there is a historical figure who was in that time who has a name similar to Quintus.
Do you think the settings depicted um, are true to the time and to the places that were being depicted?
Well, yes and no. This right here, this is out. It's supposed to be out. This is a battle which is not really, this is not a real battle. I mean, there's no one last battle that they had to win. But this area they filmed it, I suppose, is realistic, but it's not realistic because this is not what the Romans would have wanted for a battle. This is not where they would have. The way this battle progresses, I should say, is not the kind of battle the Romans would have fought. And I'll get into that in a moment here, why. But Rome is there's a lot of inaccuracies in Rome, and I will get specifically into why those inaccuracies are there, because there is a reason, and it's a directorial decision. It's not a historical decision. But I'll wait until we actually see Rome itself before I address that. The way in which this battle plays out looks great on screen, but it's pretty much not a good idea because the way the Roman infantry is marching here, you're going to see what looks good at first and then suddenly breaks down completely. For example, when you look at the infantry, you've got them carrying the huge tower shield, the scutum, and you've got them marching, as you'll see here. You use a shield wall like that, there's an advantage on that shield wall, and it's a defensive line. And what we see in this battle scene is completely the opposite of how you would fight using a shield wall. I do like this little scene right here where he goes and talks to his men. And if you read a lot of ancient sources, you get a lot of speeches. Now, whether or not they were real speeches or simply a little bit of colorful addition by the authors themselves, we don't know. Okay, we really don't know. Ancient sources are accurate and they're inaccurate at the same time because a lot of times there's ulterior motives behind why you're writing them, and you want to make it interesting. But we do get a lot of speeches in a lot of historical sources. And I love this scene because it kind of captures that feel to me in ways a lot of movies don't do. Because if you read a lot of Roman ancient sources, you get these speeches. You get these big blocks of text that were supposedly what was said. And I kind of like that they incorporated. It's a very short scene there, but at least gave that kind of idea that you're giving a speech to rally your troops. Now, one thing that's always pointed out is when you see crests on Roman helmets, I don't see a single centurion with his helmet with the proper crest. Because a crest on a centurion's helmet, for example, it goes ear to ear instead of this down the center of the helmet. It went ear to ear. And you never see that in Hollywood movies. I'm trying to think of a Hollywood movie in which I've seen that happen. I don't recall any. It looks kind of dorky. It does. It looks kind of weird. But they weren't doing it for fashion sense. They were doing it for a purpose, and that was to identify the centurion and adds height to him, kind of more imposing nature. You never see that in movies. You always see the crest going from front to back on the helmet, which it always irritated me a little bit that they never depicted the crest crop properly. Even on a centurion. I mean, centurions, we know that's what it looked like, and yet it's never seen that way in movies. They shot something like 80,000 arrows, I think it was. I mean, those are real arrows flying, flaming arrows.
That's incredible.
I guess this forest was set for to be cut down or something, and so they took advantage of the opportunity of the setting. Now, see here, they're marching properly. You know, you've got the shield wall, and it's all going to break down. And
usually, when the shield wall breaks down, then that's when you've
you've lost.
It sends your army into chaos, really.
Exactly. What you see now on the screen.
You don't want your shield wall to break.
Exactly. What you're seeing on the screen right now, the battle, the way it's going, this is how the Romans would have lost, because they had the strength in the order of way in which they were fighting, and when it breaks down to just this free for all, that's not how the Romans would have fought.
No. Well, the idea was, and there's people behind you, and it was and everyone is pushing forward on everyone else, so it's
I mean, this is kind of chaos. This is the exact way Romans would not have wanted to fight.
Way too chaotic to win a battle in a Roman.
Well, I mean, I suppose they could still win if you have superior numbers, but the Romans, had superior tactics too, and this is a complete breakdown of the Roman military tactical style. This is kind of doing the exact opposite of what they wanted to do. It looks more dramatic on film, and that's always going to be a factor in a film, is that they're looking for more dramatic presentation. Yeah, like I said, my professor came back from the movies that weekend, and he was like, I hated that movie. It was horrible. He's like, everything was wrong. Everything was wrong. Which, it's understandable. Everything, I don't want to say everything is wrong, but just about everything is wrong. But, you got to look at it from a perspective. This is a movie. This is not a historical documentary. I was in his...
Yeah, I think it's probably good to go into it expecting a historical fiction and not this isn't a biopic or like you said, documentary or anything like that. It's definitely historical.
Well, I was in his classroom to learn history.
But they can't even get the historical very accurate in the historical fiction.
Right. Well, like I said, I was in his classroom to learn history. I went to the theater to be entertained.
Right.
And the classrooms where you learn, the theaters where you go to be entertained. That's not to say that they can't be a little more realistic sometimes in film, and sometimes you get realism, sometimes you don't. But this movie, it's entertaining. There's that great line in the movie, "Are you not entertained?" I was entertained, but I wasn't educated by it.
And hopefully no one is going into it.
Richard Harris.
Were they? Were a lot of battles set in forest, or?
Typically no. A forest is not a good setting for, especially for a Roman style combat.
I wouldn't think so.
Now this is accurate. Lucilla and Commodus did in fact go to Vindolanda in it's modern day Vienna, in Austria, which was on the Germania, the Danubian border, to meet Marcus Aurelius in 180. So they did actually go there. Well, we just introduced Marcus Aurelius, and I want to kind of give a little bit of biographical information on some of these characters and what matches and what doesn't. Marcus Aurelius did, in fact, rule until 180. He actually began ruling in 160. He was adopted by the previous emperor, Antonius Pius. He was the...
adopted with the intent that he would be the next... emperor.
Yes, they've been doing that. He's the last of what we call the five good emperors. And that began with Nerva, then Trajan, Hadrian, Antonius Pius, and finally Marcus Aurelius. He was the nephew of Antonius Pius's wife. And he, of course, he's chosen to be the successor, along with Lucius Verus, who she's going to mention later as her husband. That is accurate as well. Depicting these two as the children is inaccurate because, as I mentioned to you earlier in a conversation we had, Marcus Aurelius had 14 children, and only 5 of them survived to adulthood, but there would have been 5 of them. Commodus was the only son that survived to adulthood, but he had 4 daughters, and Lucilla was actually the eldest daughter to survive, but there were 3 others. Now she was married. We're going to get to that in a little bit when we get the scene between Maximus and her when they're talking after the scene with Marcus Aurelius. And she mentions her daughter. I'm sorry, her son. The thing is, she did in fact have a son, but it's not completely accurate to the way it's portrayed here. She was married twice. She was not married just to Lucius Verus. She was married to him when she wasn't even a teenager. If she was barely a teenager. She could have been between 11 to 13, maybe 12 years old, somewhere in that range. She did marry Lucius Verus, who was the co-emperor with Marcus Aurelius. Now, Lucius Verus died in 169, but before he died, they actually had 3 children. They had 2 daughters and a son. One of the daughters died very young, and the son, Lucius Verus, he also died very young. So he was gone for over a decade by the time this movie takes place. Her other daughter did survive. The middle child did survive. She remarried in 169 to a man named Tiberius Claudius Pompeianus Quintianus, and they had a son named Pompeianus, and he's still alive. So at this time, she would have been married and had a child who was not Lucius Verus, because he's dead already. So she did have a child, but it wasn't Lucius Verus. So when we get that scene a little bit later here, it's completely wrong. Now here we have introduction of Commodus, great performance by Joachim Phoenix. He was nominated for an Oscar. He lost, as I recall. I thought he should have won, although Benicio del Toro, I think, was the winner that year. And he did a good performance, too, in the movie he was in. Commodus, he was actually a twin. He was there were twins. He had an older twin brother who died. He was born in 161, so I think his older brother, his twin brother, died when he was like 4 years old or something like that. He was made Caesar already. The way this film portrays it is him as being an outsider that Marcus Aurelius doesn't really want, or doesn't embrace as a son. That's not true. He very much was embraced as a son.
But he donned the toga at age 14, and as making him an adult in the Roman eyes, and he went through he went through the process basically of being elevated to Caesar. So there was the intent all along for by Marcus Aurelius to make him the next emperor. I mean, it was everything that Marcus Aurelius did telegraphed that this was going to happen. So.
He was given Imperatus in 176, title of Imperator, basically saying he had authority. In 176, right. In 177 he was made consul, and then he was also elevated to co-Augustus, much like Marcus Aurelius had been co-Augustus with Lucius Verus. He made his son co-Augustus as well, and he's depicted as single here. That's not true. In 178, he got married to Brutia Crispina, and they had a child. They didn't have a child together, but she couldn't. She never had children for some reason. I don't know if she was sterile. Maybe he was sterile. Who knows? They didn't have any children together. Although there's no sense that his wife was treacherous to him either, until much later, about 10 years or so. She was accused of adultery eventually, and he exiled her to Capri and then had her executed. But the thing is, he's married at this time, and he would be married until 188. For 10 years, he was married, from 178 to 188. So he would have been married at this time, and they depict him completely as single, just as his sister Lucilla would have been married as well. Now, obviously, they leave that stuff out because, in terms of the film, they want to present him as very creepy, going after his sister sexually, and his sister is somehow being available for a romance with Maximus. But it's totally inaccurate in terms of who they were.
Yeah.
Plus, of course, we have no reference to their other siblings. The other three sisters that are still alive. Now, the interesting thing about Roman history is, women in Roman society had a different standing than like women today. Women today, of course, have rights. We treat them as equal because they are equal. That wasn't the case in Roman society. Women did not have that kind of freedom and status. But nevertheless, throughout Roman history, you see women who hold a lot of power behind the scenes. Usually, very rarely do they have it in the open. My professor really hated this camp scene. He's like, that's not how you organize a camp. It's also interesting in movies how you always see people with their armor on, and everybody I've ever talked to who's worn armor, I can't say I've actually worn Roman armor. They say that it's pretty light. It's pretty comfortable for armor. At least they found it that. So they said they would never wear it. Certainly not out here where it's snowing. You don't want armor to rust. Now, Marcus Aurelius, of course, was known for some of his writing, and he was referred to even as the philosopher.
He has they actually published his meditations.
Oh yeah,
as it's called.
Yes.
His daily writings about his thoughts on, and he particularly favored the Stoics and Greek philosophy, but.
Yeah,
it's interesting that his writings survive today in written form. So his thoughts on just kind of his daily thoughts on life still persist.
Yeah, and we don't get that from every Roman emperor. Now, there was a lot of conflict during Marcus Aurelius' reign. I don't think you can blame it all on him, because at the same time, he's got to fight a defensive war. You can't say, well, it's his fault, because there was a lot of stuff going on with the Roman Empire. You had various incursions from barbarian tribes that were pressuring the borders, They were being driven westward out of Asia, and it's really the start of an ongoing process of incursion from barbarians as they continue to come in and in, and he had to face a lot of that. And so there was a lot of conflict, like you mentioned, all these years of war. But he also, he faced a time in which things were just very chaotic. You had the Antonine Plague, you had the sweep of the barbarians coming in. It was
Germanic tribes, Parthians.
Yeah, well, he
Spain was there was an incursion on Spain. It was it was very chaotic.
Yeah. Well, he kind of picked the fight with the Parthians. He kind of picked the fight with the Parthians because Antonius Pius kind of asked him to do that, more or less.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Well, that was something that Pius felt was unfinished, but yeah, I mean, there was a lot of conflict, but a lot of it was responsive. Rome was getting a lot of pressure on its borders. I mean, it was huge. It had actually been huge. It had actually been bigger before because Trajan many years earlier had expanded it to the largest extent. He was all the way out into Mesopotamia, out into Iraq, into modern day Iraq, and of course in the British frontier, he pushed it all the way up into Scotland. And his successor was Hadrian, and Hadrian pulled back. He gave up Mesopotamia. He pulled back and built what's called Hadrian's Wall to this day, which is almost near the border of modern day Scotland and England. And then Antonius Pius extended it back upward again and created what we call the Antonine Wall, which is further to the north. But for the most part, Roman expansion had ceased. So the expansion really wasn't about making the empire bigger in Marcus Aurelius' time so much as it was keeping what they had, because pressure was starting to come down on all the borders. Now, this description here, Commodus, Jesus Christ, I can't seem to name the person, Maximus. The description he just gave does not match later. And the reason is that was an ad-lib scene. Russell Crowe is actually describing his wife and his garden and his house in Australia. And that's why when he mentions her hair is dark, when we see his wife, she looks different. And that's because that's not the person he's describing. Actually, I think it's Ridley Scott's wife, who plays Maximus's wife. Now, here, of course, total fiction, how he wants Maximus. Because A, Maximus doesn't exist, but B, the idea that Marcus Aurelius did not want to give Commodus the power is fiction, because we already talked about that, how it was very clearly made obvious that Commodus was his chosen successor. And that's because, he really, he didn't adopt a son. After the Julio-Claudian line and after the Flavians, you have they're passing it on to their children or to their adoptive children in the Julio-Claudians case, or to relatives. So it's staying within the family. And after Domitian, the Senate chooses Nerva. And they chose Nerva in part because he did not have any children to pass it on to. And so he adopted a child, basically adopted an adult, is what he did, and named him as his successor, and that was Trajan. And you get that from Trajan had no children, then Hadrian, and then Antonius Pius. None of them have children, so therefore they're adopting their successor, and then passing it on to the person they've chosen, who they believe is fit. Marcus Aurelius, of course, is the first emperor in almost a century to have children, and he just naturally passed it on to his biological children instead of to an adoptive child, or adoptive. I don't say child because it's not really a child, but to an adoptive heir. And here's the scene I was talking about where they talk about their children. Obviously, everything Maximus says is relevant in terms of history because he doesn't exist. But in terms of Lucilla here, she is married at this point to Quintianus, and she has a son, Pompeianus. She's going to talk about Lucius Verus and his age being, I believe she says 8 or nearly 8. Lucius Verus, of course, was long dead at this point.
Not to be confused with the co-emperor spoken of earlier.
Yeah, well, Lucius Verus, yeah, co-emperor, and her first husband, who died in 169, and then Lucius Verus, her son, who died probably not too far off from there. I'm trying to think when Lucius Verus, the boy was born, what's 168, maybe, I think it was. He was not that important. I don't remember his birthday. I'm bad with birthdays to begin with. But yeah, so he died young. He would have been dead for a decade by this point, probably. But like I said, her son with her second husband would be alive, and her second husband would be alive. And she's totally portrayed here as being a widow.
They wouldn't have, given their distance from power, they wouldn't be much of a contest compared to Commodus, as the...
Oh, no, and they're too young.
Yeah.
Pompeianus, I mean, he's not a direct heir. He's too young. Commodus doesn't have any children, but he does have a wife. And she did adopt the title of Augusta. So she was Brutia Crispina Augusta. She was the empress. If they ever had children, that would have been likely Commodus' choice, I suppose. But they never had children.
Did she... I guess
there she is.
We could get into this later, but did Commodus' wife have much influence in the running the empire? Since Commodus, as we'll find out, didn't.
No, she didn't. She
also had no interest in influencing the course of events.
She was pretty low key. She didn't make a big splash. She just kind of. I don't want to say she was meek, but compared to a lot of Roman historical women, she was kind of meek. Like I said, he accused her of adultery in 188 and banished her, and then sent somebody to execute her a year later. But for the most part, we don't get much from her. She doesn't play a very big role. And the thing with Commodus is that he, when he comes to power, he doesn't take an interest in it either. In some ways, he's very lax on handling things, and he kind of passes it off to others to do.
Yeah, unfortunately, you can have managers, but you really need the emperor to be engaged and be a leader and have a vision and you can have someone manage things, in the direction of your vision. But Commodus did not have any of that. He had no interest in it, and so it's fine to have a manager, but you need someone with a vision. It seems like Rome lacked that.
Well, yeah, he had a man named Satyrus.
His reign.
He had someone named Satyrus who was doing everything. He kind of came. He was already in the position when Commodus comes to power, and he basically lets him run everything, and he does. He's pretty powerful. He's eventually assassinated by one of his successors, actually, Cleander. But after his death, you've also got a guy by the name of Perennis, who also runs things, and then Cleander eventually is the guy who does it, and he's basically running the government. Commodus is more concerned with his public image and with his obsession with a variety of things. Right here, we're getting a lot of talk about ambition. He didn't have that ambition. I mean, his ambition was far more a product of megalomania than it was a product of political power. He initially things didn't seem too bad with Commodus because other people were running the government, but it starts to really fall apart when he seems to go off the rails. I mean, something that you don't see here, they never address it in the film, is his fascination with Hercules. He will he dressed as Hercules, and he loved to participate in the arena. He loved gladiatorial games, and he was a skilled fighter. He was a skilled archer, and he demonstrated that in the arena. But it seemed like he was trying to replicate the concept of being Hercules. And I mean, there's a lot of statues with him depicted. Most famous is at the Capitoline Museum. It shows him in a lion's head mantle, dressed as Hercules with a club and everything. He really loved that particular persona, and he seemed to be fascinated with that and with his appearance in that respect, but not in terms of running things. And he fought numerous times in the arena. I mean, it's depicted here as just once, although we do see that scene with him practicing with. Interesting enough, they were practicing with metal swords too, which you don't usually practice with a metal sword. He always, and not with an emperor, you wouldn't, or a co-emperor, I should say. You wouldn't be practicing with a metal sword. Too dangerous. Now, this is fiction, of course, that he killed his father. There's no evidence. Yeah. There's no evidence that he did.
I believe it's thought that he died of the plague, the Antonine Plague. Isn't that right? Or
that's a possibility. Yeah.
am I?
Yeah, probably. I mean, we don't have the diagnostics of medicine today back then in order to know.
He died of some kind of.
He died of a fever.
Disease.
Yeah, he died of a fever. That's.
Okay.
You can't. What's that mean? We don't necessarily know because they didn't have the understanding of disease that we do. You mentioned, for example, the Antonine Plague. We don't know what the Antonine Plague was. Could have been smallpox. Could have been measles. Most likely smallpox, but we don't know what disease it specifically was because the sources are not going into depth on that.
It's interesting he's depicted as having a beard. Facial hair wasn't particularly common or popular among aristocrats.
Actually, that's not true. It was by that point. By that point, yes, it was.
Oh, by that point. I knew that one of the emperors had kind of made it popular. I can't remember which one.
Hadrian. Facial hair was not popular with the Roman aristocracy until Hadrian. Hadrian was a hellophile. He enjoyed Greek culture, and you look at the Romans and barbarians. What is barbarian really the root from? It's the root word is barbus, and that is beard. So barbarians were the people with beards. Romans didn't wear beards up until Hadrian. Hadrian did, and it brought them into style. And pretty much every emperor from that point has a beard. Marcus.
I suppose his appreciation for Stoicism may have also. He obviously appreciated Greek culture as much as Hadrian had, so I guess that would make sense.
Well,
he may have had a beard.
Commodus had a beard. There's depictions of Commodus with a beard, so I mean.
Oh, is there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So after Hadrian,
it's acceptable.
He sort of sets the precedent and breaks the beard wall of the ceiling or whatever. Yeah.
Also, remember, prior to Hadrian, with all the people not wearing beards, they didn't shave. You plucked.
That sounds incredibly uncomfortable.
Yeah, there's accounts of the screams of people getting their hair plucked because that's not I can't imagine doing that.
No, absolutely not.
I mean, there's some things you can do in the name of fashion, but plucking beard hairs just isn't one of them.
Plucking
Not for me.
Plucking facial hair isn't one of mine. Yeah.
There we see the wife, which doesn't match the description that Maximus gave, because that's not who he is describing. And that's an interesting little feature there. There's bones out there, which I suppose it's not unrealistic after a battle, although something cleaned those bones pretty quick.
Yeah.
Now, you are a Doctor Who fan like I am, and it's just interesting to note that the actor right there who's about to execute him is the same actor who would go on to play in the 11th Doctor, Vincent in the Doctor. He played Vincent van Gogh. That's the actor who played Vincent van Gogh. I only bring that up because I know we're both Doctor Who fans.
Yeah. Not a stranger to playing historical figures.
Now, an interesting note about the Praetorian. Praetorian Guard were drawn heavily from the equestrian class, which is not the senatorial class, and that really picks up with later emperors, especially from Commodus onward, because the senatorial class and the emperors kind of drifted apart, starting with Commodus. It becomes a big separation between the two.
He does a lot to make that happen.
Yeah, but
certainly there's a huge shift in the, at least if it wasn't obvious before, it was certainly obvious, going forward, that the center of power was continuously shifting away from the aristocracy and moving toward the Praetorian Guard and whatever.
The equestrian class. The
equestrian class.
Yeah, we had that scene earlier where the senators were talking to Maximus, and they mentioned something about, why not? Rome was founded as a republic, and I'm going to touch on it a little bit later in the scene at the Senate. Rome wasn't founded as a republic. It was originally, we tend to think of the word republic. The Romans didn't think of the word republic. I mean, their government was not an elected government of a Senate. They had a wide-ranging government. They had lots of different forms of legislative bodies. You had the Curia. You had the various tribal assemblies, and you had the Senate. But by this point, that concept's gone. All that stuff starts to disappear, or at least in terms of its power, it disappears. And you really, at this point, only have the Senate and the Emperor running things. And
instead of positions being elected, per se, they were appointed by basically appointed by the Emperor at this point.
Well, no, you that was one way. You could be appointed by the Emperor. You also, if you were a senator, obviously the power in the Senate stayed within the Senate. Only a quaestor could become a senator. And
I was thinking of consuls and things like that.
Yeah, well, so that's separate from the Senate. I mean, that's not the same thing.
Right. Yeah. But there were positions that before before I guess uh, before the transition after Julius Caesar, there were positions that were certainly there where there were elections
Oh yeah.
among the different Roman assemblies,
Hmm.
and a lot of
But at the same time, it was
a lot
also,
of the conflict was who was being given the power to vote in those elections.
well, the thing is that a lot of the assemblies were not democratic. They were purely democratic. You didn't elect somebody; you yourself represented yourself. The tribal assemblies were not all about. They weren't. All the assemblies did not have a basis of representative democracy. They were pure democracy. People were, the families were actually represented themselves. Now here we get a crucifixion. It is mentioned later that they are crucified. I hear a lot of people say they were hanged. They did not hang them; they crucified them. It's a good performance by Russell Crowe. It was actually his second Academy Award nomination. He'd been nominated a year or two before.
Yeah, crucifixion was very specific but commonplace action by the Romans, especially in toward people who were not citizens.
Well, crucifixion is a way of executing somebody and making a statement about it.
Yeah,
Just make an example of them.
right,
I mean, if you just want to kill somebody, you just kill somebody. You don't go through the trouble of letting them.
right. Of crucifixion.
Yeah, because I mean, you don't.
Crucifixion was a statement to the community as much as it was punishing someone the Romans wanted to punish. So.
Yeah, and I mean, you don't die instantly. You don't die from your wounds. You're not being suffocated, or you're being suffocated, but you're not being suffocated by a noose around your neck. Well, your body weight is hanging from your arms, and the body weight presses down your lungs. You're hanging there, and a human body's not made to hang like that. There's a lot of confusion over crucifixion and the belief that somehow they put nails through the palm of the hand. They didn't. The palm of the bones and muscle of the hand are not strong enough. They actually put the nail through your arm. But you're hanging by your arms, and you basically suffocate because you can't breathe. Which is why if they wanted to be show a little more mercy, they'd break your legs, because invariably, if your legs weren't broken, you would use your legs to try to pull yourself up so you could catch your breath easier. And then eventually you'd tire out, and then you'd suffocate. So if they break the legs of the person, they couldn't do that, and they would die a lot faster. And it's a lot less. I don't want to say less painful, because it's still painful. I believe they filmed this.
But you're enduring a shorter time, I guess.
Yeah, well, yeah, you're giving them a lot less of a struggle. I think they filmed these in Spain or Malta. Actually, may have filmed it in both. This is Oliver Reed's last film. He plays Proximo. He died during production, which is why at the end of the movie, when you see the final scene with Proximo, the final scenes during the attack on his compound, he wasn't alive to film that. They had to use a body double, and then they had to recycle footage from earlier in place because he was simply not there anymore. Jimon Hansu is actually another movie I highly recommend we do a commentary track on, and that is Amistad. Now, gladiatorial games actually go back in history a lot. I mean, this takes place in 180, between 180 182, somewhere in that range, I guess. And gladiatorial games actually go back at this point 500 years. The first gladiatorial combat was probably done by the Campanians. That's a tribe in central Italy, around 310 BCE. And the first Roman games, which you can call Roman games, were called munus. A munus is basically part of the munera, that's the plural version, were part of funeral rites, sort of a funeral celebration. And in 264 BCE, a guy by the name of Decimus Junius Brutus Sceva held 3 gladiatorial fights in honor of, I believe it was his father, who had passed away. They were held in the city of Rome in what's called the Forum Boarium, which is it's the cattle market near the river. It's where the old docks were at. There's still there are still a couple remains of it there. The Temple of Portunus, for example, that's part of that forum. And that's where the first gladiatorial fight was fought. And other people would do that, and they'd hold the munera during funerals and celebrations like that. And it became more and more popular over time, all the way up until the point to which Augustus eventually had to step in because these things were becoming so elaborate. I mean, you wouldn't just have like 3 fights. You'd have 100 fights. You'd have a dozen fights, whatever. You'd have just large number of gladiatorial contests going on, and it was extremely expensive. And people would try to one-up themselves, or one-up their, keep up the Joneses and one-up your neighbor. If your father dies, then you've got to have a bigger celebration with more gladiatorial combat than your neighbor's brother, your political opponent's brother or father or whatever.
It was a status.
Yeah, very much. It became a bit of status to have a more and more elaborate show. Plus, it was a way to use your political influence. The aristocratic families in Rome vied for the power that came with popular appeal. And so they would invest in large public projects. Julius Caesar, for example, he built a forum. Pompey the Great, he built a theater. They built these public works projects to gain the favor of the people. And whereas the assemblies go out of pretty much are eliminated as political power, prior to that you had this competition to be the most popular and have the most power that came with it, because when everybody's in the various councils that existed, you've got the different assemblies, you've got influence. If your influence then translates into political power, it's lobbying. Basically you're lobbying the people to support you, which increases your power and your prestige. but yeah, they continued to get larger and more expensive and bigger until finally Augustus had to step in and say, we're going to regulate these things. And from that point forward, they were more organized by the state than they were private. And of course, the public works projects didn't cease just because the emperors had replaced the assemblies. The Colosseum itself was built by Vespasian and completed by his son Titus, and there was a symbol in doing that because the Colosseum itself was built on the spot of the old Domus Aurea. That was Nero's golden house, his big, huge mansion. There was a fire in Rome, and a lot of the city burned down. And in its place, with all that prime real estate next to the Forum, Nero built his Domus Aurea, his golden house. And his huge palace. He had a private lake and all this stuff. And on the side of the private lake, Vespasian, who of course comes to power after the power struggle following Nero's suicide, he built the Colosseum on the site of the lake in the Domus Aurea, because he was translating that this private residence of the emperor is now gone, and we're going to put a house for the people of the Colosseum, this big public works project that is meant for your entertainment, not mine, your entertainment. So it's a
politically astute move by the emperor. Yeah.
Yes, it's a political statement, is what it is.
Yeah.
All right, now we're looking at some gladiators here. This film doesn't portray gladiatorial combat accurately. I know that's going to be a running theme here. You've seen some helmets that are accurate, but the combat itself is not accurate.
There are different kinds of gladiatorial combat.
Well, there's different types of gladiators as well. Gladiatorial combat was pretty organized in terms of who faced who. I use the example of it being more compared to modern wrestling, where they've got their personas and they've got their. It's very dramatized. It's very staged. And okay, here we're seeing basically just a free for all. I mean, we've got all these different types of gladiators out here, and they're just fighting each other. That's not how it would have gone most of the time. Although in this case, we seem to be it's a clear setup of one side is supposed to win, the other side's not. But you see some of the gladiators here they are wearing accurate gear. There were different types of gladiators. Early on, you had some gladiator types that were based upon the enemies of Rome. So you had the Gallus, who basically was the Gaul. He was the character of the Gaul. You had the Samnite, who was Samnites were an Italian tribe that the Romans eventually absorbed into them. And as they did this, after the Julius Caesar conquered Gaul, they absorbed the Gauls into Roman society, and so they changed the personas began to change. They eliminated the Gallus, they eliminated the Samnite, and they replaced them. The Gallus, for example, becomes what's called the Secutor, and we're going to see a guy here who's got a Secutor helmet. That guy right there, actually, which you saw on the screen, with the rounded helmet. That's a Secutor helmet. The Secutor is he's known as the Fishman. I'm not sorry, the Fishman. The Fisherman. Sorry. No, the Fisherman is the Retiaris. He's the fish. Secutor is the fish. It's a variation of what's called the Murmillo, which we also saw in there. There we go. That's that kind of helmet we're talking about. It's rounded on the top. It doesn't have. It's got eye holes, but it doesn't have anything that can be caught on. There's a reason for that. He's wearing what's called a manica on his right arm. That's his sword arm, and he's wearing the. He's wearing some. Is he wearing? I think he's wearing greaves. I didn't catch that. Greaves, which are what are they called? Acria. The acria is the greave, and they get the loincloth, which is the I can never pronounce this. Subliculum. Yeah, subliculum, which is like that padded loincloth that they wear. They didn't wear a lot of clothes, and they got the baltius, the belt over top of it. But he's called the Secutor. And he would have been paired up against a Retiarius. The Retiarius is the fisherman. We didn't see him in there, but he would have fought with a trident and a net. He would have had the loincloth and the belt as well, but very little other armor. And the two would face off, the fisherman and the fish. And you'd get these pairings of different types. There's another type called the fishman, the Murmillo. He's got the fish on his helmet. He had that big crested helmet. It's called the Cassis Christa. And it's actually a Greek-style helmet. It's got the crest in the front, or the crest on the top, and the grill in the front. And he's fighting with sword and shield. And he's fighting against the Retiarius, who has the net. Now, the reason the Secutor has a smooth helmet is so the net can't catch on it as easily. Because the net could definitely catch on the helmet of a Murmillo because of the decoration. But you've got these two different types fighting. The Retiarius, for example, is very lightly armored, so he's not going to tire. So his chance of winning is pretty low if he doesn't last. The Secutor, or the Murmillo, they are heavily armored. So if they can cut him down pretty fast. They can beat him. But if the Retiarius can basically hold out, he wins because he just tires out his opponent. So they're paired with each other, playing off their strengths and their weaknesses. But you would see them paired off against these. The Murmillo would also be paired off in what's called a Hoplomachus, which is a Greek hoplite soldier. So he had the Greek bronze hoplite helmet, the round shield, spear or gladius, and again, it's playing off an enemy of the Roman Empire. Now here we get this scene with the Rome. Okay, I'm going to get back to the gladiators in a bit, but that scene we just saw of Rome is completely fiction. That's not what Rome looked like. There's no big avenue from the Colosseum leading to this huge open space that they were in. That's actually Ridley Scott's decision. He wanted to replicate the look of the German documentary, Leni Riefenstahl. I think I just pronounced her name completely wrong. I can never remember how to pronounce her name. Triumph of the Will, which was talking about which is basically demonstrating the power of the Nazis, and the imagery is all taken from Triumph of the Will. So that big open area didn't exist. Now here in the Senate, Lucilla shouldn't be there. Okay, the Senate, we are the people, chosen from among the people to speak for the people. That's not how the Senate was done. It's not a democratic body.
It was all aristocrats composed the Senate.
Right. Well, it was a senatorial class.
Right.
Equestrians could sometimes be elevated to that if the emperor so chose, but didn't happen much. Women wouldn't have been allowed. She shouldn't be there. There's reference to the plague, which of course would be the Antonine Plague. Now, his disdain for the senatorial class is not fiction. That is true. Communists did not get along with the Senate. And it's from this point forward, a lot of emperors just dismissed the Senate, but they had worked with the Senate prior to that. In theory, the Senate chose the emperor. In reality, they didn't, but with one exception, that's Nerva. Nerva was, in fact, chosen by the Senate.
And after this, they really don't factor in much.
No, from this point forward, it's pure military, and the equestrians become far more important. The Praetorian. They literally chose the emperor. The Praetorians begin to choose the emperor more than anything. The senatorial class is still around, but it loses its power more or less from Commodus onward. But Commodus is sort of the buffer zone between the two, between the age where the Senate had some power and the age where the Senate becomes irrelevant.
emperors really, communists forward, don't have much interest and don't have much. They really don't care what the Senate thinks. And before this, emperors would at least try to, respond to senators' various, concerns, but
Well,
to greater or lesser extent. But
the Senate rises in power with the empire because while all the other councils still exist, more or less, they don't have any power. It's all put into the power of the Senate and theoretically and the emperor. While emperors maintain a lot more power than the Senate in some ways, the Senate really governs. Augustus has the power, but he wisely knows that he doesn't want to be seen as a king or a dictator. I use dictator not in the Roman sense of the word, but in the modern sense of the word. And so he maintains the lip service, if you will, that the Senate is in power, even though he consolidates the majority of power with himself and relegates the Senate to some lesser powers.
there was a certain inherited fear of kings stemming back from Rome's early origins as a kingdom and a despotism that came with that. And they certainly, and emperors know that there's a certain stigma around trying to assert yourself as a king.
Exactly.
Try to,
no, exactly. Augustus knew that wouldn't fly, and so he very wisely paid lip service to the Senate, even as he was controlling stuff. But they didn't trust the Senate either. Emperors and the Senate didn't. The emperors didn't trust the Senate because they always saw that if I'm gone, somebody's going to, ambitious, going to step up. Which is actually that's why the equestrian class becomes more and more powerful from Commodus onward, because he doesn't trust the Senate. None of them, they never really did, but they began trusting more and more the power of putting the power into the hands of the praetorian and the equestrian class, because those people owed their position to the emperor, and not to being a senator already and being the son of a senator, because you became a senator because you were the son of a senator, so you didn't owe anything to the emperor. But the equestrian class could be elevated by the emperor, and they didn't have the ambition where they were going to become the next person in power. And so they began to trust the equestrian class more and more. Now here we see some more gladiators. You can see in the back there, you can see, did we see a Murmillo? We see Thracian. Just going kind of quickly, I can't make them all out. There's a secutor right there with the rounded helmet. There's a hoplite. Hoplimarchus. Okay, there we go. There's the classic fishman, classic Murmillo. Now, gladiators were rarely killed. I mean, it's an investment. You don't kill. And so I would say this is actually very inaccurate combat, except for the fact that Maximus doesn't give a damn, as we'll see here in a second when he basically yells at the crowd. Here he throws his sword. I mean, he just more or less killed all of them, and that's kind of a loss. That's not a very good way to make money. You put a lot of training into a gladiator. Gladiators fought. Well, I mean, it's not to say they weren't trained to fight, because they were. Okay, that guy's still alive. I see him moving, but still, gladiatorial combat very rarely featured death. Gladiators faced off against each other, and it was usually submission. One of them would surrender, because it's too much of an investment to kill them. They did have killing. Killing went on in the gladiatorial arena, but it wasn't gladiators who were killed. It was usually criminals or other undesirables. There's a term, the Nazi, which basically means criminal, enemy of the state, something like that, is an exact translation.
Well, you really want, as with entertainment today, you want to invest in the gladiators. The you know whether it's today we would you know I maybe like you said the wrestlers or whatever you provide certain level of medical care and things like that. You don't want to you put a lot of money into training them and so yeah you it would be awfully expensive to then dispose of them in the arena. So.
Yeah, I mean, you did have, the games were more than just gladiators coming out there. There's a lot of entertainment. You had performances, you had beast hunting, you had guys called venators, and they basically hunted animals there in the arena. And the arena combat became.
Commodus himself enjoyed some of that.
Yes, he did. He did a lot of it, in fact. And you had these guys called Pagniarius, which are they're like an entertainment fighter. They're not really fighting. They're more of a entertainment type thing. And you had there's a lot of pomp and circumstance. I would say circumstance, but a lot of pomp and ceremony in terms of the religious aspects too, because the games were not put on like Monday Night Football. Okay, it's not a scheduled thing. You have someone who sponsors a game. They're called the editor, and they put it on. They hire everything, and that's what the family rituals for funerals would have an editor, person putting it on, and they would hire gladiators from people like Proximo here, who would be referred to as a lanista. He's the owner of gladiators, and so they would contract the lanista, and the lanista has no interest in. He's going to be really compensated if he's going to lose his gladiators, and so you're basically fighting to submission. That's why and they didn't wear much armor. I mean, there's armor on key parts like the arm. They wear the manica on their arm to make sure that their arm doesn't take a hit, but their chests are exposed. I think I can only remember one type of gladiator that I can ever recall that wore a breastplate, and that was called the provocateur. They wore a legionary costume, and that otherwise you don't wear a breastplate. So he's wearing a breastplate here. He's wearing a cuirass, and you wouldn't wear that because you want to be able to see the blood of a swipe across the chest. You're going to see the blood, and since you're not fighting to the death, you don't need the protection to keep yourself from dying, because the kill is not necessarily going to happen. They're not fighting to kill; they're fighting to make a spectacle of it. Which is why that scene. I mean, gladiators were well trained, but at the same time, that scene with Maximus just beating gladiator after gladiator, it's kind of that's not that unrealistic if you think about the fact that he's a soldier who does not want to be a gladiator. He's not going in there to entertain people. He's not going in there to fight for spectacle. They're going in there with the idea that they're going to make a spectacle of him. He's going in there and he's just going to clean up the room, as it will. But for the most part, you wouldn't see that kind of combat where you just have somebody going out in this random outfit versus some bunch of other gladiators. Like I said, the Murmillo would be opposite another type of gladiator. A Retiarius would be up against a secutor. You would not find just all of them thrown out there for the just what
you want to tell a story.
Yeah,
and,
well,
these are characters, in the story that you're trying to tell.
It's not so you're telling a story so much as you're conforming to a story. You're presenting presenting a known story in a sense. The imagery, the symbolism is all there. And in gladiatorial combat didn't always involve man on man, as we'll see in this movie with chariots. But you had cavalry, you had chariot fighters. But the thing is that they were usually paired against each other. So you have chariot fighters would be against chariot fighters. Chariot fighters were called Essedarius. But an Essedaria they'd be fighting against each other, not against a bunch of just random gladiatorial types on foot. You'd have Sagittarius archers. They'd be facing, against archers. You pair them off, or in those kinds would usually face each other. You had, the Bestiarius. They'd be beast fighters. Now, so if they're not telling the traditional symbolic pairings, they're paired against equal types. And gladiatorial combat in the Colosseum was big because it was built on top of the lake that was part of the Domus Aurea, which they actually were able to flood the floor of the Colosseum and hold mock naval battles where they had ships fighting each other. Literally ships fighting each other in the Colosseum. So it became very much spectacle, but it was always kind of it was very much paired, like you said, to tell a story, a specific depiction of something. There we see a statue by the Colosseum. The Colosseum gets its name, by the way, from the Colossus statue of Nero. And it's officially it's a Flavian amphitheater. The colossal statue of Nero, Commodus would modify. And I'm gonna get into that in a little bit here as we talk about his increasing megalomania. Now here we see Commodus with Lucius, and again, Lucius didn't survive. He was gone by this point. She's already Lucilla's remarried, and she has a son whose name is Pompeianus at this point. So this is total fiction right here. But going back to the gladiators, you would not have seen that kind of fighting that we saw earlier. That's not how it was done. Some other types of gladiators I didn't mention, but we did see examples out in there. The other was the Thracian, which is similar to the Hoplomachus. He had a curved sword, though. I don't think I saw anybody with a curved sword, but it went so fast I didn't get a good view to see if they had it or not. But they were paired against different types. The Thracian would not be facing off against an archer. You'd be facing off against a Hoplomachus, or you'd see a Murmillo versus, of course, the Retiarius. You'd see the Secutor versus the Retiarius. Because there's that association with the I won't say symbolic, iconic matchup, because it's very iconic. Everybody knows what the symbolism is, which is what makes an icon versus a symbol. Secutors were associated with the god Vulcan, whereas a Retiarius is associated with the god Neptune. So you've got fire versus water. Obviously, the fisherman versus the chaser, the fish. What we're not going to see that in this movie, because the gladiatorial combat in this movie is not the type of Roman combat you'd see. But there's little details in this movie that they do get right that you don't necessarily see in a lot of other historical films featuring gladiators. And I'm kind of holding off on mentioning that right now because it's coming up soon. We were talking through it, but there was the scene earlier with Proximo talking to Maximus, and he mentioned that the emperor touched him on the sword, touched him with the wooden sword, gave him a wooden sword called the wooden sword was, in fact, that's how it was done. That's how a gladiator earned his freedom, so to speak, is that he was granted a wooden sword, and that's actually accurate. They got that right. Something that needs to be said about this movie that I didn't mention earlier is that the script is basically from an earlier movie in many ways. It's following the story of an earlier film called The Fall of the Roman Empire. Right down to being Commodus. That story's slightly different. Stars Alec Guinness and Christopher Plummer. it's a little bit changed. The script's a little bit changed. There's a different character rather than Maximus, the different hero, but it's more or less the same story. Again, that's not historically accurate either. That guy's eyebrows are killer eyebrows. Whew. Now, underneath the Colosseum, there were just lots of passages and elevators and every trick imaginable to bring people onto the arena floor, and just a huge network of rooms and cages and cells.
They would have had to have aqueducts for, the ships to float and to bring water in and things like that, I guess.
Well, that was already there because it was built on the site of the lake.
On the lake, yeah.
So the system to bring the water was already there. Because it was not a natural lake; it was a man-made lake.
Right.
Now, as we mentioned,
I imagine the animals would have been kept in cages.
yeah,
Where would the gladiators also have been in cages, or where would they have been?
they would have been in cells below as well. I mean, they didn't stay there
Cells
permanently.
below.
I mean, you had training camps. The most
Right.
famous is actually, well, that was the most famous, but there's one that's excavated partially. It's right next to the Colosseum. But they were all over. I mean, gladiatorial combat wasn't just in Rome, as we saw earlier, that earlier scene. There were arenas all over the place. I've only been to a couple besides the Colosseum. I've been to, kind of funny enough, there's actually one in downtown London. It's the city hall is the square in front of that has actually got they've marked out the pavement with stones that indicate the shape of the arena that was in Londinium, the old Roman London. But there's remains of them throughout the empire, all over the place. Some of them are in very good shape. In France, there's some, and in Spain, there's some that are in very good shape. There's others in Italy as well. Pompeii actually, I believe, had the first arena. The Colosseum, though, was the biggest. It's built. Construction began in 69 by Vespasian on the site of the Domus Aurea. It was completed under the reign of Titus, his son. So it took over 10 years to complete. But it was the biggest. It held about 50,000 people, which made it the largest arena of its kind. And it actually, I think, might have been the largest arena until modern times. Modern football, soccer stadiums, and everything. The thing with the crowd is the crowd actually, when it came to gladiatorial combat, we mentioned that there's the different types of gladiators. They had fandoms, and the fans would get into fights in the stands between fans of, say, the fans of the people who had what were called scudum. That's the tower shield you see there versus a round shield. They would fight in the crowd. The fans that were fans of one particular type versus the other type.
Well, that would never happen today.
Oh no, never, never. It's nothing at all like modern, soccer or anything, or football, or crowds today. No,
Sure.
nothing like it. No, of course not. Perish the thought.
And today we do plenty of that. I mean, just as emperors sponsored games and aristocrats sponsored games throughout the empire. The same could be said for today. We put a lot of tax money into various professional sports stadiums and entertainment of all kinds, from films to art, things like that. So it's nothing new, and yeah, people get into it, and people have favorites, and people it certainly engages people in an activity, I guess, that is maybe you could argue one way or the other that better than going into the streets arguing about other things.
Yeah. The Colosseum here is partially constructed, partially digital. They didn't build all the tiers of it. They built part of it, and it's not a complete. While the Colosseum itself is an oval, this recreation of it was built as a quarter of an oval, and not all the levels were built. So it's a lot of CGI constructed into it. They've taken what they physically built and then they've added CGI to flesh it out completely.
And this would be early days for CGI still.
No, it's a decade into it. I mean, this is 7 years after Jurassic Park. Now those little columns you see.
It's not like today though.
No, you see those pillars that are in the middle of the Colosseum, running around the ring. You can see them in the background in some shots. Those don't exist. They're right there. You can see them You can see them there as the chariots come in. Those big pillars standing out there are no such evidence for those things. That was Ridley Scott's idea. He felt that there's a lot of machismo, a lot of testosterone with gladiatorial combat. So he wanted those added because he thought it just makes sense to have some phallic imagery in this very manly sport type thing. So there's no evidence for such things out in the middle of the Colosseum like that. That's Ridley Scott's idea. Now here we see some female gladiators. That's not fiction. They actually existed. Gladiatrix was a real thing. What wasn't realistic is they probably would not have been fighting against men. Women tend to fight women. There's not a lot of evidence for what they did. We know that they primarily fought women and animals. They didn't fight men. In this case, they're also on. They're basically Esidarius type gladiators. They're the Esidaria because they're on chariots. Again, you don't have chariots versus men on foot. You'd have chariot versus chariot. With archers versus archers. So this is not how gladiatorial combat had gone. Although here they're telling a story, which again kind of relates to the idea of entertainment aspect of it. And in this case, you'd have, Commodus is the editor. He's the guy sponsoring the games. These are probably what we refer to as the plebeian games, which he did put on. He did sponsor what are called the plebeian games, which and for people out there who are always worried about horses, no horses were injured in this film. And I know it looks pretty realistic, actually. It's a really well-directed fight scene, even if it's not historically accurate. Now, here when we see, he hits him with the helmet right there. Hits her with the helmet, and you can tell the helmet's rubber because if you actually looked at the little spine on the top of the helmet, it just kind of wiggled back and forth. I imagine modern, like you said, CGI, they would probably have corrected that, but they didn't notice it.
Sure.
There's actually a scene in here where you can see a guy wearing blue jeans. He got away. It was somebody with the production crew just was in front of the camera at the wrong time and nobody noticed it and made it into the film. And I believe there's another scene where you can see somebody with a wristwatch, an extra with the wristwatch. He didn't take it off like he should have. Again, we hear Hans Zimmer's score, which is just amazing. I love this score. I've got the soundtrack. I love the soundtrack. Now, again, that's pretty expensive to kill all those gladiators. I mean, true, Commodus didn't care. Typically, when you killed, and the people who were killed in the arena were criminals or the like. It wasn't gladiators, not well-trained gladiators. That's not to say you couldn't do it. It's just expensive. And while Commodus did spend a lot of money on the games, it still wouldn't have been that common. Like I said, I've been to the Colosseum. Even in its ruined state, it is a magnificent building. you get the feeling just when you're there of just the immense power and ability the Roman Empire had to create such lasting structures. It really is one of my favorite places in the world because it's just gorgeous. I mean, even in its ruined state, I mean, you can sit there and you can see some parts of the marble that are still there. But
It's a marble. Yeah.
yeah, it is. It is.
I'd like to see it someday. Yeah, certainly.
Now here we have Commodus liked to fight. He didn't necessarily go out into the arena just for for the hell of it. He did compete. He had a special platform built once so he could he was a very good archer and basically shoot animals. Just boom, 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 boom. This film downplays his love of gladiatorial combat in terms of his participation in it. He loved to participate in gladiatorial combat. Mind you, he didn't participate in the kind of combat where they're doing, which is serious. He did fight in the arena, but it was using wooden weapons, and nobody really was allowed. He didn't kill anybody. We'll see that later in the movie when he comes out there. It's not out of the realm. I've heard people who didn't know anything about history say it's unrealistic that the emperor would go out there and fight in the arena. It's like, no, not with Commodus. It wasn't.
It was a bit of an embarrassment for the emperor to be doing something that the lowest of social classes is doing.
It wasn't an embarrassment. It was a disgrace from the perspective of the Senate and the aristocracy. They viewed it as that. Right. He didn't.
No, yeah, I wasn't speaking of him. Yeah, I meant the Senate, sure. Yeah. And he wanted the Senate to be there for the games.
Well, there's actually an example where he beheaded an animal. I think it was an ostrich, because they love to bring exotic animals. He took the head and he walked over to a bunch of senators and he more or less told them, "This is you." I mean, he was antagonistic to the Senate, so he didn't really care what they thought of him anyhow. Yeah. Okay, here's another problem. We're about to have a major problem with Maximus in terms of, I mean, from a Roman historian's perspective. He's going to say his name. Okay, he just called himself Maximus Decimus Meridius. Roman naming, Roman nomenclature was not the same as we have today. They did not have a first name, a middle name, and a last name. You had your first name, your like in his case Maximus, as they said, is what your family would call you. It's your proper name. The middle part of a Roman name is your family name. For example, my middle name is Nicholas. I would not have Nicholas in the middle. My middle name, my nomen, my name, which is your family, would be Mount. So, for example, he said Maximus Decimus Meridius. He would be from the Decimus family, just like Gaius Julius Caesar is from the Julian family. He's the Julius family. And so, therefore, everybody's calling him Maximus. You have what's called a cognomen in Roman nomenclature, and that's your common name. That's what people refer to you as. That's your last part of your name. So, for example, Gaius Julius Caesar is referred to as Caesar. People called him Caesar. Everybody refers to him as Maximus. Therefore, his name, if it's Maximus Decimus Meridius, should actually be Decimus Meridius Maximus. That's how he should have presented it. Now, here we have another problem. We got the emperor signaling death or not. He's sticking out his thumb, which people are like, oh, thumbs up, you survived. Thumbs down, you died. That's not how the Romans did it. When the editor would, indicate, or in this case, the emperor would indicate whether a gladiator should live or die. Most of the time, they didn't fight to the death to begin with. But if for some reason they did fight to the death, or there was a decision where it came down to death, showing the thumb indicated death. It wasn't thumbs up's life, thumbs down is death. Showing the thumb, giving them the thumb, turning of the thumb, meant death. So he should have he should not have signaled anything with the thumb to indicate survival. Showing the thumb like that, thumbs up didn't make a difference. We don't know exactly how they did it, but the thumb indicated death. Some say that that it was a downward thrust with the thumb, indicating sort of like sticking with the sword. But the point is, it's called the turning the thumb, and that indicated death. So sticking his thumb out is not the good way to keep the guy alive.
No, that could have been easily misinterpreted by.
Well, it would have been misinterpreted because just that would have indicated death.
Yeah. All right, well, let's do this. Yeah.
Yeah, you see that in movies all the time, and that's just not. That's the product of later people who didn't know what it meant, and they were just artists depicted, for example.
Sure.
But yeah, in terms of the name, my name, would not be Jason Nicholas Mount. If I was a Roman, my name would be Jason Mount. And actually, I guess it wouldn't be Jason Mount Nicholas because nobody calls me Nicholas either. They don't call me by my middle name. Most people call me Jason, so therefore I guess the Jason would be the last. But I didn't. That's the difference between our names and cognomen. A cognomen is your common name. And since everybody's calling him Maximus, that's clearly not his family name. It shouldn't be coming at the end. His name would have been Decimus Meridius Maximus. So they get the nomenclature wrong, which is common in movies as well. People call Julius Caesar Julius Caesar. Nobody called him Julius Caesar. They would have called him, his family would have called him Gaius, and people would have called him Caesar. Nobody would have called him Julius because that's simply not, that's his family name. Now, the real Lucilla grew very, very wary of Commodus because, he wasn't doing what he was supposed to do. He wasn't administrating properly. He was becoming far more and more unhinged. In 191, there was a fire in Rome, and he had to reconstruct a lot of numerous buildings and were rebuilt. And he renamed the city, and he renamed the empire, he renamed the legions, he renamed everything. He renamed the city of Rome was called Colonia Lucia Annia Commodia. Commodiana. And he renamed the Senate after himself.
That went well, as someone who's seen lots of things get renamed in my lifetime. That always is a popular thing to do.
Well, I mean, his megalomania becomes worse. But the thing is that's in
He's naming everything after himself.
That's in 192. That's 10 years after Lucilla dies. Lucilla actually, we don't know why, the exact reason for her decision to conspire against him. It might have been the possibility that Crispina, the empress, might have had a child. Might have gotten pregnant. If she did, the child didn't survive. We don't know exactly what it is, but she began to plot. She plotted with with various other people. She was married at the time I mentioned to her husband, but her husband was not in on the plot. We know that the people that were in on the plot were her daughter, who was the daughter of Lucius Verus, the daughter that survived. Quintianus, who was also named after her, the nephew of her second husband, Quintianus. They had the same name. It's very confusing. Also, some cousins. She had two cousins, a boy and a girl, a male and a female cousin, Annianus and Faustina. They were in on it, as well as the Publius. What's his name? I've got it written down here. Publius Terranen. I can never pronounce these names. I'm horrible at it. Terentius Paternus, who was the Praetorian prefect, and so there were numerous people conspiring against him in 182, which is when I'm assuming this is going to have to take place. Obviously, it's not too long after Marcus Aurelius' death. So they did plan a 182 assassination attempt. The plan didn't go as planned, obviously. He survived. Quintianus, that would be the nephew of her husband, her second husband, was hiding. I believe it was in a theater. He was hiding and waiting for Commodus to arrive. And Commodus, he did. And Quintianus, he sprung out of hiding with a sword or a dagger or something like that, some sort of weapon drawn. But instead of just striking him like an assassin should do, if you want to kill somebody, you kill him fast, he didn't do that. He instead made some comment about, this is on behalf of the Senate, something to that effect, courtesy of the Senate. And the time it took him to do that, Commodus's guards recognized what was going on and jumped him and tackled him to the ground and disarmed him. And so the attempt fails.
Yeah, that's yeah, that's not a great way to go about an assassination.
Well, Quintianus and
really botched that one.
Yeah, Quintianus and the male cousin Annianus were both executed.
Yeah.
Lucilla and Faustina, that's her, that's the other cousin.
The cousin.
Yeah, they were banished to the Isle of Capri, and a year later, in 183, Commodus had them both executed. So, in this film, obviously, we're going to see spoilers. Hi. She's gonna survive. In reality, she did not survive 182 or 183. I'm sorry. She was executed.
You have to wonder, did she not expect to be killed a year later? I wonder why she didn't try to flee from her
guards. Capri is an island. Capri is an island off the coast of Italy. It's off the Bay of Naples, and that was where it was an imperial retreat, imperial resort, so to speak. The Emperor Tiberius spent almost his entire reign there, and it was basically there's a palace on the site, and that's where Tiberius is said to have stood on the cliff and pushed his slaves off the cliff to see if they could survive the fall, and it's weird stuff like that. There have been guards there, and it's an island.
Not easy to get off the island.
Well, I mean, it's easy to get off the island, but not when there's guards everywhere. I mean, she wasn't like living just hey, go to that little island and have fun.
She was clearly in prison, house arrest of sorts.
Yes, more or less, yeah. Reminiscent of the famous phrase, because you did have the grain dole, but that's that famous phrase from Juvenal, bread and circuses. Yeah. That's the way to appease the crowd. It's all people cared about. If they got a full stomach and they're entertained, they don't care that they don't have rights. Okay, this is a fictional character, obviously. This guy is Tigris of Gaul is actually played by a guy by the name of Sven Ole Thorsen. Now, he's been in a lot of movies, and he's actually a close friend of Arnold Schwarzenegger. They've known each other for a long time. They did a lot of movies together. He appears in a lot of Schwarzenegger's movies, and he was in, for example, Predator. He's in the jungle. He's one of the soldiers that they kill. Now there we saw the shot of Proximo. That shot's going to be reused later. We mortals are but shadows and dust. They're going to recycle that very shot at the end of the movie. Notice the people standing behind him are gladiators and not legionary. And you're going to see that later in the movie. They reused that shot at the end because, they said he died. All right, so here we have we have a Roman gladiator in the form of Maximus coming out there with a round shield of gladius, and he's got a cuirass. Again, mentioned that the only Roman soldier who would have been wearing a cuirass like that would have been, it just wouldn't have been. You wouldn't have had somebody going out there with a round sword, a shield, and a gladius fighting against this other guy who's got a very stylized helmet. It's not unusual for stylized helmets to exist, but you've got one-on-one combat here, and this is not the type of one-on-one combat that you would see. If you had one-on-one combat, it would be far more pairing with the iconic pairings that would have occurred. For the dramatic purposes, obviously, they're going to make this out. The helmet that he's got there is pretty cool looking, but is totally a creation. There's no historical, helmet that they're basing that on, precisely. It is a creation for this film. Animals were featured in combat, as mentioned. There was you had beast hunting in the arena, and then you had people, gladiators who fought beasts only. No other men participating. We see right coming up here. Okay, there's the trapdoor. The various trapdoors with the tigers. Those existed. They actually had trapdoors and to bring people on the stage for fight and to bring in animals and stuff like that. And you can see the guys on the side with gates on the side. It was just a complex system of elevators to bring these things up. It was a marvel of engineering, to be honest.
And certainly, those we can see trapdoors and theaters and things today. Even
that's the.
I think the TV show Alf even had trapdoors and things in there. So.
Alf was real. Don't say that.
What's that?
Alf was real. Don't say that.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Shame on you. What are you saying?
Yeah,
you've ruined my childhood.
I apologize. Yeah,
you've ruined my childhood. Now, see the motion they're making with the thumb down in a stabbing motion. That's the kill symbol. That's really kind of a lot more like what it would have been, probably. We don't know precisely. Obviously, we get an account, but we don't get a completely accurate account in detail because the Roman writer didn't think to say, 2,000 years now, people want to know exactly how we did this. As mentioned before, Commodus fought many times in the arena. The combat was always against people who were armed with wooden swords. He had a wooden sword. He never killed anybody. He spared them all, they would submit. And it was actually considered a bit of a mark of pride for a gladiator to have fought the emperor. So if they had a scar on them, that was a mark of pride that they got a scar from fighting the emperor. But he didn't actually kill anybody. When he was fighting in the games. He did, however, kill hundreds upon hundreds of animals. I shouldn't say he didn't kill any gladiators. He did kill people. There's an account of him. They took a bunch of amputees. Obviously in ancient times you had infection. You lost a limb or something like that. Anyway, they took these amputees and they tied them together and created giants. Now, how exactly they did it, I don't know. But I can imagine, you got people tied together to on top of each other, and he killed them because it was like he was slaying giants. Is what he was supposed to be doing. It was sort of
Sounds
it was
horrific.
theater,
Yeah.
very theatrical.
Right.
There's an account of him of them lining up a bunch of people, and him just clubbing them on the head one at a time, just boom, 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 boom down the line. So he did kill people. I shouldn't say he didn't kill people. He didn't kill the gladiators, and it wasn't the gladiatorial combat. They were obviously not, they were pulling their punches. They didn't want to injure him because that is not a good way to survive either. But he fought a lot of animals. He fought lions. He fought giraffes. I mentioned earlier he fought an ostrich. He fought elephants. Actually, I think he fought 3 elephants. It might have been 3 elephants at the same time.
Not much in the way of disability rights in the Roman Empire.
No, no, not at all. Although at the same time, you could say that they a lot better than some cultures. Obviously
It's hard to compare.
yeah, the Greeks had a far different
today.
view of it.
United States today, or
Yeah, no, you can't.
to
I mean, you did have
another culture in another time.
the Emperor Claudius was looked down upon because of his disability. He had a club foot and a bent. He was a very weak child. He had physical deformities, so he was looked down upon. Ironically, he's one of the best emperors. He's one of my favorites. But yeah, in ancient times, disability usually meant death. I mean, the Spartans, they had no room for disability. Heck, they didn't even have room for women. They killed women. They killed female babies. Just because they were useless in their eyes. The gladiators were
The art director for the film is David Alday, and it's kind of interesting. His filmography as art director before that has things like Ever After and Notting Hill, but after this, he goes on to do other a wide variety of art direction for a lot of different films, including Elizabeth and Robin Hood and things like that. So he's certainly had a long career both before and after this film. And
screenwriter John Logan had a career before and after as well. Ironically, I'm a Star Trek fan. When I heard that he was going to be writing Star Trek Nemesis, I was like, oh, we got a good writer writing a script. Yeah, I don't know what he did wrong there. Star Trek Nemesis was not a good movie. And of course, Ridley Scott is a director. It's a crime the man's never won an Oscar for directing.
it certainly is. Yeah. Incredible talent.
Oh yeah, I mean, he's got so many films I absolutely adore. Alien, Blade Runner, Gladiator. It's just he's got his filmography is so varied, and it's every film. He makes a good movie. He knows how to make a good movie.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of famous directors who didn't win Oscars. But I thought he had it. I thought he had it this year, and I was a little disappointed. I was hoping he would get it. I really did think he might have a shot.
And it's a little surprising. Hollywood likes a good epic and things like that. So
Yeah, but there hadn't
this
been a
seems
sword and sandal like this in a while.
Seems like right up their alley.
Yeah, but there hadn't been a big sword and shield sword and sandal movie like this in a while. I mean, this brought these kinds of films back, because you then had a rush to make Alexander, which was a flop. You had the one about the Trojan War with Brad Pitt. So it was a short-lived revival, but you still see him. Although sometimes they go with more of a science fiction type thing. But
Sure.
you've had John Carter of Mars, which is kind of following this a little bit. It's got a scene in an arena as well. Nobody was able to duplicate the success of Gladiator, but it did inspire imitation. Plus, then there's always your cheap knockoffs. But you hadn't seen sword and sorcery I'm sorry, sword and sandal movies for a while. You've seen sword and sorcery with like the old Arnold Schwarzenegger, Conan the Barbarian films and stuff like that. And you get a lot of B movies that continue to use themes similar to that, but they don't have the budget. They don't look as good because they don't have the budget. They don't have the actors. Now there's a little scene where they're making fun of Commodus. Commodus was popular with the people, even if it wasn't popular with the senatorial class.
Well, as you said, bread and circuses go a long way. And yeah, they didn't have a reason not to like him. So.
Now, I've talked about the 182 assassination and how it failed. There was, of course, another assassination. I'll get into that a little bit later. That didn't fail, but actually didn't work out quite the same way either. Now, this scene here, they're going to mention a few little details here with the idea of what Marcus Aurelius wanted, and that's just not so. Ostia, of course, is the harbor, the port harbor for Rome. Rome is inland; it's on the Tiber River. Ostia is on the west coast, and that is the artificial harbor that was built for the fleet, the Roman fleet. Now, this takes place, like I said, in the 180s. I mentioned earlier that after in 191 there was a fire in Rome, and he rebuilt a bunch of buildings and he renamed everything. He renamed the buildings. He renamed the Senate. He renamed the palace, not the planet. He renamed the empire. I meant to say the empire. I don't know. He renamed the entire empire, and he actually renamed the Roman people. He called them the Commodianes rather than Romans. They were the Commodiani.
It's very humble of him.
It's clear megalomania begins to set in. Mentioned he dressed up as Hercules. He had statues of himself as Hercules put all over. I mentioned the Colossus of Rome, the statue outside the Colosseum. He had the head replaced with his head. He had the head of Nero taken off and had his head put on it. He clearly there was some problems going on with him. It's just narcissism and megalomania, not a good combination. And it just it got to be too much for everybody. Now the second assassination attempt was made in 192, and after his wife Crispina, when she died, he had a mistress named Marcia. She was apparently in on the assassination when she found out that her name was on the list of targets for the plebeian games. So she was going to be executed. She didn't know she was on the list. She found the list. She realized, I'm on the list of people he intends to kill. A prefect named Latus was also on there, and another one called Eclectus. And so the three of them conspired to assassinate him. She was going to poison his food. She did, in fact, poison Commodus's food. He threw up, though. He vomited and voided the poison from his body. And so they made a decision. They sent a man named Narcissus. Now, Narcissus was a wrestling partner for Commodus. Training you wrestle to physical training because he was in good shape. Commodus was considered to be a very very physically fit man. Yeah. And so Narcissus was his trainer. He would wrestle with him and he also did combat training with him. And they had Narcissus execute him. Basically, Narcissus walked into his bedroom. He found Commodus drunk in his bath, and he strangled him. He just strangled him, and that's how Commodus died. Kind of an inglorious death, not too amazing a death. We know the date of it. That was December 31st of the year 192. So 10 years after this film is taking place. He's still around for 10 more years before he's finally assassinated. In reality, this assassination attempt, Lucilla dies. Everybody, not everybody who dies, but everybody who participated in it died. And he survives. But he will eventually be strangled 10 years later by a wrestler named Narcissus. Obviously, for dramatic purposes, they wanted it to look different. And this story, as I said, is also heavily taken from that earlier film, where in that film he fights the hero of that film as well and dies.
The Praetorian Guard has a great idea for how to fill the role of Emperor once Commodus dies.
Yeah, well, yeah, I would.
Not a great idea, objectively, but they thought it was a great idea.
Well, it benefited them.
Yeah.
Yes,
they put the job up for auction.
More or less, yeah. Well, you had these two guys basically on either side of the wall, just sitting there, offering more and more to the Praetorian to back them. The Praetorians had a role before. The Praetorian, have assassinated an emperor before. Domitian, the Emperor Domitian.
Yep. And they named a successor before.
Well, the Senate named the successor, Nerva.
Oh, Nerva, that's right.
Yeah. Nerva was the official successor. And he was named that's the only time the Senate officially did it. I mean, the Senate did it. They always named the successor, but it was a given who the successor was going to be.
So they were told who to name.
Yeah, it was rubber stamp, yeah. But in the case of Nerva, that was the Senate actually choosing the successor. And that's what ushers in.
They won't have that luxury after this assassination.
And they never have it again. The emperors choose their successor with adoption of who they want to have take over afterwards. And then, of course, Marcus Aurelius chooses his son. And then after this, it's out of the hands of the Senate. The Senate starts to become more or less irrelevant. That's the Praetorian, as I said, the equestrian class rises in power. Equestrian is basically a knight, if you will. Okay, they're horsemen, cavalrymen. They're not common soldiers. But they're not senatorial class either. They're the second highest tier in Roman society. And like I said, emperors chose them because, in some cases, they chose the emperor, and put their faith in them because they didn't trust the senatorial class. Because obviously senators might be ambitious in seeking to replace them, but they didn't even trust the Praetorian because for example, you have governors where usually the emperors began to choose governors from the equestrian class, but they also didn't put them in positions where they were the sole choice, especially in something like, say, in Egypt, where Egypt is where the Romans got their grain. They weren't going to, put one person in charge. They didn't want a senator running it. It was an imperial province, which meant it was administered by the emperor. Augustus made sure that all the most important provinces were imperial provinces, and the Senate had the stuff that couldn't support itself. And they weren't going to put it in the hands of one person. And they didn't want to put it in the hands of the senator, because the senator, they didn't want to have that kind of power. And they couldn't, so they put it in the hands of the equestrian class. But at the same time, they still didn't trust them enough to give them sole power, because you don't want, being an emperor is not what it's cracked up to be. You're constantly worried that somebody's going to off you.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, look at Nero.
For good reason, because
yeah.
a lot of them were.
Yeah. I mean, but Nero, Nero was very, very paranoid about that kind of stuff. Although he didn't always have to worry about offing people, because his mother did a lot of that for him. She did. She cleared a path to him becoming emperor. He wasn't supposed to be emperor. That was her. She was married to the emperor Claudius, but that was her son from an earlier marriage, and there were a lot of other Claudians that could have become emperor, and she offed them one by one until Nero was the only person left. Of course, Nero, he recognized that, which is why he decided to off her too. Had her executed, because he realized, Mom just took out everybody. All she has to do now is take me out, and she's the only person standing. Right. See, the reason of leaving out the entirety of her second marriage is because they wouldn't have scenes like this, where she says she loves him, and her father loved him, and all that. And obviously, they have to rewrite the story completely to add this element that was not historical in the least. Yeah. Now, Commodus was considered to be, really muscular. He was considered to be handsome and muscular, and not the kind of wuss he's portrayed here, not the cowardly wuss that he's portrayed. He never really did fight in terms of battle, although he was prepared to. It ended up not being necessary. But he was highly trained in terms of combat. He was an excellent archer. And although obviously his gladiatorial combat in the arena was never in question who was going to win, he wasn't unskilled.
He grew up, with his father, and his father was obviously was out on the borders a lot, fighting various incursions, and he would not have been a stranger to military camps, but he also was, gladiatorial combat is obviously different, and he wouldn't have been a stranger to that, because when he was in Rome, or anywhere where there was gladiatorial combat, he appreciated it.
He was also well educated.
Yeah.
He was also well educated. I mean,
he had the same, upbringing and education that Marcus Aurelius had.
Yeah. Yeah, he was. He had obviously what he fixated on, as opposed to what his father did. His father, obviously found philosophy and things like that to be far more interesting. Where Commodus, he fixated on the iconography of Hercules and the gladiatorial combat. And he's not the first Roman emperor to have some weird interests, but he definitely was the one that indulged them. Indulged them publicly to a degree that had not been seen. I mean, Nero fancied himself an actor. But Commodus is,
which was also unseemly by
the Romans.
Senators.
As I said before, many a time, Nero was a terrible person, but he's not as bad as he's painted out to be. I mean, he's still horrible. A lot of that animosity comes from ancient sources, which were written by people who didn't like him. Domitian, I think, suffers even worse because I don't think he was that bad an emperor compared to like a Nero or Gaius Caligula or Commodus. Now here he's telling a story which is also just total bull. He refers to our ancestors. He talks about Mark Antony. And Mark Antony was not considered an ancestor of the Caesars. No, he was actually the rival of Augustus. They were members of the
family.
Yeah, they were. He was Julius Caesar's trusted aide, and he was a member of the Second Triumvirate. And his Augustus's Octavian, I'm gonna call him Octavian because he wasn't Augustus at that point. Octavian's animosity towards Mark Antony was what basically led to the collapse of the Second Triumvirate. Mark Antony also, was kind of foolish. He wasn't very good at politicking, and Octavian was master at it. But Mark Antony would not have been our ancestors. There's no way that would have been, Commodus would have thought of Mark Antony as an ancestor.
Yeah, I don't know if he's trying to portray in a general sense, and I don't know what's.
All right.
And I don't know why he would even think of Mark Antony in any sense.
All right, there. That scene with Proximo is you could clearly tell he was superimposed onto the image digitally, because he wasn't there to film a lot of the stuff. That's right there. The person walking is not. It's not the actor. That's a stand-in, a body double filling in for him because he had Oliver Reed had passed away during production. So they had to cobble that scene together with earlier footage and then a body double, a second person portraying Proximo from behind or from a distance, out of focus.
Sure.
And the final scene with Proximo here, where he gets killed by the Praetorian. If you look at the final shot of we see him from behind. We don't actually see Proximo. When we see Proximo, he says shadows and dust. That's the same line that was used in the scene when Maximus went up into the arena. Now, gladiators were actually used in the military. Marcus Aurelius had to resort to using them, in fact. But occasionally they were conscripted, so to speak, by the military when Rome needed soldiers. It would happen usually in the later empire after this point, as the Roman military began to break down in terms of its effectiveness in dealing with the barbarian threats. This scene right here with Proximo, that's his Rudius, his wooden sword. And so we see him from behind. That's not actually Oliver Reed, and we're going to get the shot here of Oliver Reed saying shadows and dust. And if you look at behind him, those are gladiators. Those are not Praetorian outfits. there's a nice shot of Rome, which isn't exactly accurate, but not. It's still pretty. Um, I can say I as an insomniac, I would go out for walks just before dawn in the city of Rome when I was there, and it is beautiful to see the sunrise over the Forum. It really is. It's a beautiful sight. It's the time to go out too, because it's not as hot as it gets in midday in Rome. At least not in the summer when I was there. Now Joaquin Phoenix is giving a command performance here. He's got the creepy, the angry, the just unhinged. He's got it down. Connie Nielsen's good as well as Lucilla. I don't believe she was nominated for. It was just the two nominations for Joaquin Phoenix and Russell Crowe. Russell Crowe won for Best Actor, and Phoenix lost for Best Supporting Actor.
Yeah, it won best special effects, visual effects, and best sound, best costume design. Russell Crowe, as you said, won, and best picture. So. But it certainly swept up a lot of nominations. So.
Well, no film that year was really nominated all that much. It was up against Traffic, which won Best Director and Best Supporting Actor. So what else was up against? Erin Brockovich, which won Best Actress for Julia Roberts. No film that year had a huge number of nominations, but it did emerge as the film that won the most, including the most prestigious Best Picture. As I recall, they actually had Elizabeth Taylor present an award, which kind of was sort of a nod to the fact that she was in some epics, Cleopatra, for example. I don't know if you can say he was a coward. The actual Commodus was a coward. He never was tested on the field of combat, but he was prepared to go. Peace was reached, and he never ended up having to.
He wasn't particularly interested in continuing the war, so.
No, he actually. They mentioned at the beginning we had that battle, to defeat Germania. That's the last stronghold that stands in the way of peace. The war continued after Marcus Aurelius died and Commodus ended it. He signed he passed, went and made the effort for peace, ended the conflict. Marcus Aurelius, no victory did it. It wasn't a victory of Marcus Aurelius as emperor.
Yeah.
it didn't happen until Commodus did it.
I think he would have probably Marcus Aurelius would have pressed on. But it's hard to say.
Yeah, well, I mean, he died.
Yeah.
He died literally up there at in modern day Austria. But there you see the elevator. That's accurate. They had elevators to bring people up onto the sand.
How did those work? Were they?
Electric power? No.
All right. Right.
No.
I'm not that global. Yeah.
System of pulleys.
Yeah. It would have taken a lot of people, I would think, to.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of people involved in running the games.
Sure.
Plus, you have slave labor doing stuff. You know, the thing that Roman Empire had was they had slave labor. That was part of why it failed. You know, an empire that huge, literally a quarter of the world's population, and their source of power was not steam power. It was not electric. It was not, you know, petroleum. It was slave power. It only goes so far. You have to replenish slaves. Slaves, you know, it's not a very efficient means of running technology. It was obviously highly effective for what it did, but Rome extended itself far too much and did not have the technological capabilities to maintain an empire as technologically advanced and as large as it was. It was ahead of its time. And with the plagues that hit Rome, they began to lose population. I mean, I think it's safe to say the population of Rome reached its of the Roman Empire, that is, never recovered from the Antonine Plague and the plagues that followed, and just all the carnage that happened. It began to go down. I mean, by the time Rome itself, the city, falls in 476, it's a backwater. It's not even the capital anymore. The capital's up at Ravenna.
And they're having trouble getting food from the east, which was their bread basket, basically.
Yeah, Egypt. In addition to that, they're just having trouble altogether. They're under constant pressure on their borders. The tribes don't integrate the way that they used to. It's impossible to maintain an empire that large at the time in which they did it. They overextended themselves. At the same time, they also failed to advance further in terms of size to fuel their empire. You know, they're running out of people. They're running out of resources.
And the legions that they do have are too busy fighting each other over who was going to be emperor and not. They were.
Well, they don't have loyalty to the emperor, or to that matter to the Rome itself.
To the empire. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's no loyalty to the empire itself. It's
the cohesiveness of the empire disintegrates as it begins. I mean, the idea is still there, and the idea will, fascinate Europe for thousands of years. I mean, all the way into the 20th century. Benito Mussolini, was fascinated with the idea of the Roman Empire. It continues, but whereas the idea continued, the fascination with it, the actual functionality of it began to fail. But of course, remember, the Western Roman Empire is all that falls in 476. The Eastern Empire continues again until the 15th century.
Sure.
Constantinople goes down in 1453. I think it's like 1478 that the last Byzantine city falls. It continued on in the Eastern form. But the Eastern Empire was completely different, though, in terms of how it functioned.
Function, culture, all that.
Yeah, it was Greek.
It was a different trajectory.
It was Greek, not Latin. So yeah, here we got Commodus dying in the arena, which is not where he died. He did die, but he didn't die to a gladiator. It's completely, fiction. Good drama though. I mean, it's a fun movie. It's a good movie. It's well done. but at the same time, it's a good tight script as far as storytelling, as far as history is concerned. No, it's not good history. Heck, it's not even average history. I mean, it's bad. We've chronicled so much that's wrong with it in terms of historical accuracy. And I don't want to take away though from the fact that this is a fun movie, a good movie. It's
entertaining.
Yeah, exactly. Commodus asks, "Are you?" Or not Commodus. I'm sorry. Maximus asks, "Are you not entertained?" And I was entertained. That's what counts.
Absolutely.
In the end of the day, that's what counts when you go to the theater. Is I've been entertained. This is a movie I've got. I bought it. I got it in VHS, and I got it on DVD. I just it comes out. I want it because it's a good movie. I like it. As someone who studied Roman history in college, that I didn't go into it looking for Roman history. I went into it looking to be entertained, but and it did that.
And it's fun to just imagine what these places might have looked like back in the day, even if they didn't get it quite right. It's fun to kind of imagine with them what the scenery what Rome might have looked like.
Well, yeah, when I went to Europe, I saw my first Roman ruins when I was there in London, because London was obviously Londinium, and it's a small little park where there's a section of the old Roman wall of London, Londinium. And I'll tell you, when I got there, I took a photograph of it from different angles, and then I put the the camera, I put it into my pocket. I was wearing a jacket, it was a little chilly. And I walked up to it, and I reached out my hand, and I just touched the wall. And I stood there for a second, I was touching something built by the people that I had studied, who'd been dead for 2,000 years almost. And there's a power to that. And that it goes on to this day. The Roman Empire and the Republic before it, they influence our culture in ways we don't even realize. And there's just this sense of not just history, but awe in what they accomplished. I mean, you see the Colosseum; it's big. It's not as big as as modern football stadiums or something like that, but it is big. And then you think about the fact that we build them with cranes, diesel power cranes, and they didn't have that.
And we're starting to 3D print things. So.
Yeah.
We're a long ways, and they were, these are engineering marvels, as you said, with the elevators and the aqueducts.
No, the use of concrete. I mean, the
Romans.
The use of concrete. The Romans used concrete better than anybody until the 20th century. I mean, even their knowledge of underwater concrete that would set underwater, that was lost for well over 1,000 years. I mean, that was lost until basically modern times. There's just something about the Romans that fascinates us to this day, and it's hard to say what it is. For me, it just it caught my fancy when I was reading about history when I was in high school, and there was something about it that I wanted to learn more. And when I went to Rome, I went out one morning, actually more than one morning, but the first morning I went out there, and I just walked around the city and past the Forum, and just to see that and to think that I'm looking on these buildings which have been here 2,000 years almost. Some of them actually more than that. And it's just amazing to stop there and just take it in and realize that leaders for centuries looked upon Rome as the model for what they wanted to be. Not necessarily what they were or what they would be, but what they aspired to be. I love that shot here, the final shot with the sun. That captured very much what it felt like to look at Rome. But yeah, there's just something about Rome that will always stand with us. And that's why Rome is the eternal city. It really is. So, I mean, overall, I give this film an A. If I had to give it a grade, A, 4 stars. This is a great movie. I love it. And at the same time, from a historical perspective, I've got to give it an F. It's horrible history, but it's incredible entertainment. As he said, are you entertained? I was entertained, and that's what counts at the end of the day. Well, for those of you watching this commentary track, I hope you've enjoyed yourself. Hope you've enjoyed our conversation here. Maybe you learned something. Maybe you didn't. Maybe you already knew everything we talked about. Maybe you didn't know any of it. The goal in learning is always to just keep doing it and to never give up, because the more you know, the more you can understand not just the movie, not just the past, but also the present day in which we live in. And thank you, Anthony, for joining me in this commentary track.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure, and I enjoyed discussing this time period and discussing the movie, and it was fun to do.
Oh yeah, there's something to be said for watching a movie and talking about it afterwards. A movie is great to take in our sense. There's, by the way, to our friend Oliver Reed, as we said, he passed away. There's something to be said for watching a movie and having a conversation about it, because the best movies are really the movies that make you talk or make you think and make you want to learn, make you want to know more than what you just saw. I don't think we do that enough in movies anymore. I think with people binge watching movies, they just, or television shows, they just watch them, boom, 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 boom. They're on to the next, and they don't stop to think about what they saw. And that's a shame, because there's a time when watching film was a social thing. And I'm old enough to remember going to theaters and then having a conversation with my family afterwards, and then conversing with my friends, going to school and talking about the movie that we just saw. And it doesn't happen that much anymore. I mean, it does with some people, but not everybody. Some people just kind of forget about it and they're off to the next movie or the next television show, and you lose something when you do that.
Well, the best of entertainment are things that have you thinking afterward, and certainly this film has had people thinking afterward, including us, and hopefully you'll have other people thinking afterward too.
Yeah, historical inaccurate or not, it doesn't make a difference. If it just gets somebody to pick up a book and learn actually what happened, that's a win from an educational standpoint. In my opinion, an educator would say that's a win if you can just find a way to engage people. And that's part of why these commentary tracks, we want to do these things, is to engage people that might not want to go into it thinking, oh, history's boring. Here you can make it kind of fun, and then if you actually read about it, I'll tell you, Roman history is full of sex and violence and plots far more treacherous than anything you'll find in a movie.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And that's not just Roman history. That goes for all of history. There's some stories out there that are just amazing. There are stories where if you saw them in a movie, you'd be like, that's unbelievable. I don't believe that. And it's what happened. It's just something that does not translate to people because they don't know about it. And if they can see something in a movie that makes them take an interest and pick up a book, or heck, even just surf the web and find something, you never know. You could spark an interest that could last a lifetime. For me, I went into history. It was something that I learned about things a little bit. And I can still remember when I was really young, I would be fascinated by documentaries I'd see, and they inspired me to want to learn more about what they were talking about, because it was presented to me in a format that I was enjoyable, but which I could then take and say, I want to learn more and turn it into true knowledge. It's amazing the number of people that go into a film nowadays.
Yeah, these credits are just
Well, these are nothing compared to a lot
these
of
are
films.
nothing compared to what we see today.
Yeah, obviously.
Yeah, we were talking earlier, about all the work that went into the gladiatorial games with the various elevators and things. It's,
Oh yeah, I mean everything that goes
and
into putting it.
this is no different. It's everyone from top to bottom. It's you have to have people
Morocco.
all the way down the list.
They filmed in Morocco, not Spain. I was wrong about where they filmed it. It was Morocco.
Okay, Morocco.
Yeah. Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and I hope you enjoyed the film. And check out Historia Scientia. We try to give you as much as we can, both in terms of historical documentaries, as well as commentary tracks and other things that maybe will catch your interest. So even if you think history is boring, maybe we'll find a way that you will enjoy it. And if you feel like supporting us, we're very happy if you would. Every little bit counts, and we hope you have a great time out there learning about history, both from us and from other sources. And you appreciate the fact that what was still is and always will be, because history, the past, present, and future, they are all intertwined. And thank you again, Anthony. And
Thanks.
with that,
Take care.
everybody take care. Bye.